Chapter 3: Interdependence and the Gains from Trade. Recall principle number 5 from the 10 principles of economics. Trade can make everyone better off. So, as I have promised early in chapter 1, my plan here is to prove that trade is a good thing, and it means, as it says. To start, let us consider the term interdependence. It means that a situation that you rely on many people from around the world to provide you with the goods and services that you enjoy. In discussing about trade, we need to assume that everyone in the trading sectors are interdependent, such that they have to be self-dependent and between one another. And more importantly, everyone chooses to be self-sufficient. These are the assumptions in discussing about the trade topic. Here, let us review the Production Possibilities Frontier, or PPF, in more depth. Recall the PPF is the various mixes of output that an economy can produce, but we would like to restrict the scope of two goods in this study. Consider that there are two agents here, Frank the farmer and Ruby the rancher. Let us look at the table. Take the red frame first, which can tell us the time or number of minutes that Frank and Ruby can produce meat and potatoes. Start with the meat production. To produce 1 ounce of meat, Frank needs 60 minutes, while Ruby can produce just in 20 minutes. Whereas under the potato production, Frank can produce 1 ounce in 15 minutes, and Ruby can do in just 10 minutes. Next, if we take a look at the blue frame, it can tell us the amount of quantity that Frank and Ruby can produce meat and potatoes given at the same time of 8 hours. In such case, Frank can produce 8 ounces of meat and Ruby at 24 ounces of meat in 8 hours. Whilst in the potato production, Frank can produce 32 ounces and Ruby at 48 ounces. Having seen this indication, both by time and quantity, we can say that Ruby is more productive than Frank in the two productions, meat and potatoes. Now, if we take the data of Frank and Ruby's productions with respect to the quantities, not by time, we can plot it on a graph and draw the PPF. So Frank's PPF is presented on the left such that we can see his optimal production is at point A, given at 4 ounces of meat and 16 ounces of potatoes. We can calculate the slope of Frank's PPF, which we take 8 minus 0 divided by 32 minus 0, and it equals to 1/4. On the other hand, Ruby's PPF is presented as the graph on the right, given with her quantity produced in meat and potatoes, we can draw down her PPF. Here, we can say that Ruby's optimal production is at point B, such that she can produce meat at 32 ounces and potatoes at 24 ounces. If we calculate the slope of this PPF, we can do so by taking 24 minus 0 divided by 48 minus 0, and it equals to 1/2. To pinpoint the optimal output on the PPF line is that we can just take the midpoint on the two axes and calculate the slope as long as it has the same value as the slope that we have done earlier. Now let us discuss how specialization and trade work. Be reminded that Ruby is good and productive more than Frank in both industries, meat and potatoes. So here I would like to make up a story. Since Ruby knows that she is more productive than Frank, she proposes a trade deal such that 1. Frank gets 5 ounces of meat, but he needs to give away 15 ounces of potatoes. And 2. Ruby gives away 5 ounces of meat, but she will get back 15 ounces of potatoes. Please note that here, get refers to a positive return, so I put the plus sign on top of it. And give refers to a negative return, so I put the negative sign on top of it. Let us take a look at the table. Start with the first row, production and consumption without trade. This is the optimal point of Frank and Ruby, such that Frank can produce 4 ounces of meat and 16 ounces of potatoes, whereas Ruby's optimal production point is that she can produce 12 ounces of meat and 24 ounces of potatoes. Please skip the second line and go to the third line and put down the proposed trade deal. Per Ruby, she proposes that Frank will get 5 ounces of meat but gives away 15 ounces of potatoes, and herself will give away 5 ounces of meat but she will get back 15 ounces of potatoes. Now take us back to the second line. Since Frank knows that per the trade deal he will get 5 ounces of meat, but he does not need to produce meat, so it is 0 ounce of meat under production with trade. Because he does not have anything to do with meat production, Frank focuses solely on potatoes production, such that he will produce at his full capacity of 32 ounces of potatoes. Here, please be reminded that at Frank's decision of 0 ounce of meat and 32 ounces of potatoes is still his optimal production point. Why? Because as we described the specification of the PPF, as long as a point that sits on the PPF border, it is the optimal point. On the other hand, in Ruby's case, since she knows that she will give away 5 ounces of meat but gets back 15 ounces of potatoes, she has to choose the optimal production point at 18 ounces of meat and 12 ounces of potatoes. Why at this point? If we calculate the slope of this point, it is 24 minus 18 divided by 12 minus 0, and it is 1 over 2, the same value as the slope that we calculated earlier. Now take the next line, add consumption with trade. Since Frank does not produce meat at all, but gets 5 ounces from trade, he can consume it as is. But for potatoes, since Frank produces at 32 ounces but gives away 15 ounces, he has left with 17 ounces. However, for Ruby, since she produces 18 ounces of meat but later has to give away 5 ounces, she has left 13 ounces. But for potatoes, since she produces 12 ounces herself and gets another 15 ounces from trade, she ends up with 27 ounces to consume. And lastly, we can come down to evaluate the end result due to trade deal. We compare between before and after the trade deal under consumption of the two productions. We can find that before trade, Frank can produce and consume for himself 4 ounces of meat, but after trade, he has left to consume 5 ounces of meat, so he ends up gaining 1 ounce of meat. Under potatoes, before trade, Frank can produce and consume for himself 16 ounces, but after trade, he has left to consume 17 ounces, so he gains additional 1 ounce of potatoes. For Ruby, before trade, she can produce and consume for herself 12 ounces of meat, but after trade, she has left 13 ounces to consume, so she gains additional 1 ounce. And under potatoes, before trade, Ruby can produce and consume for herself 24 ounces, but after trade, she has 27 ounces to consume, so she gains 3 ounces. Given the findings that we have discovered, we can confirm that Frank should specialize in potato productions and Ruby should specialize in meat productions because we can see that it makes sense that under production with trade, Frank can solely focus on potatoes while giving up meat production, and Ruby can be productive at her optimal point such that she can produce meat at greater quantity than that of potatoes. After all, we can witness that trade can make everyone better off, as claimed in the principle number 5 of the 10 principle of economics. Then trade is a good thing. Now consider the findings that we have discovered earlier and plotted on a graph. Take a look at Frank's production and consumption before and after trade. At point A, that is before trade, Frank produces and consumes for himself at 4 ounces of meat and 16 ounces of potatoes. Under proposed trade deal, Frank has to produce 32 ounces of potatoes, but he can just produce 0 ounces of meat. After trade, Frank's consumption ends up at point A star, such that he can have 5 ounces of meat and 17 ounces of potatoes to consume. Whereas for Ruby production and consumption before and after trade, point B represents her productions and consumption without trade, such that she has 12 ounces of meat and 24 ounces of potatoes. Under the proposed trade deal, she has to produce 18 ounces of meat and 12 ounces of potatoes. After trade, Ruby has left to consume at point B star at 13 ounces of meat and 27 ounces of potatoes. Let us take turn to discuss the absolute advantage, which means the ability that a producer can produce a good using fewer inputs or at greater output than another producer. Per our study on Frank and Ruby's PPF, let us find out who wins the absolute advantage. Recall the given data. If we look at it by time, in producing meat per the same ounce, Frank uses 60 minutes and Ruby only uses 20 minutes. So here Ruby wins the absolute advantage. And in producing potatoes per the same ounce, Frank uses 15 minutes and Ruby only uses 10 minutes. Again, Ruby wins the absolute advantage. If we look at it by quantity, given at 8 hours time interval in producing meat, Frank can produce 8 ounces and Ruby can produce up to 24 ounces. So Ruby wins the absolute advantage. And in producing potatoes, Frank can produce 32 ounces and Ruby can produce up to 48 ounces. Again, Ruby wins the absolute advantage. After all, Ruby wins absolute advantage in both productions by time and by quantity. Can we ask this question? Should Frank and Ruby trade with each other? We know that Ruby has proposed a trade deal and found that trade can make the two of them better off. So we have a job to affirm this claim. To dig it further, we need to find it under the concept of comparative advantage. The comparative advantage is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. Let us remind that the opportunity cost is the slope of the PPF that we have calculated earlier. So let us revisit the slope of Frank and Ruby's PPF. We found that the slope of Frank's PPF is 1/4. So we can explain that to produce 1 ounce of meat, Frank has to produce 4 ounces of potatoes, or 1 ounce of meat costs 4 ounces of potatoes. If we take the reciprocal form, it is 1 ounce of potatoes costs 1/4 ounce of meat. On the other hand, under Ruby's PPF, the slope is 1/2. So we can just say that 1 ounce of meat costs 2 ounces of potatoes, or in reciprocal form, it is 1 ounce of potatoes costs half ounce of meat. Then if we do the comparison, we find that to produce 1 ounce of meat, it costs Frank 4 ounces of potatoes, but it costs Ruby only 2 ounces of potatoes. Here, I would like you to think that the opportunity cost or cost in general, it means a negative thing. So the lower the cost, the better. As such, we can say that because Ruby has lower opportunity cost to produce meat, such that it costs her only 2 ounces of potatoes, while it costs Frank 4 ounces of potatoes, Ruby has a comparative advantage in producing meat, whereas in producing potatoes, it costs Frank 1/4 ounce of meat, while it costs Ruby 1/2 ounce of meat. Frank has the lower opportunity cost here, so Frank has a comparative advantage in producing potatoes. Now, after what we have discussed, we wonder why trade can make everyone better off, and the proposed trade deal makes sense. So here I would like us to consider the price of trade. It means that the price of trade must lie between the two opportunity costs. Per the proposed trade deal, it is 5 ounces of meat equals to 15 ounces of potatoes, regardless of who will get or give away. So we can simplify that 1 ounce of meat is 3 ounces of potatoes. Here, because Frank knows that his opportunity cost of producing 1 ounce of meat, it costs him 4 ounces of potatoes, and this is less cost for him on the trade, he will trade potatoes. On the other hand, if we take the reciprocal form of the trade deal, we can come up that 1 ounce of potatoes is 1/3 ounce of meat. So Ruby thinks that it makes sense for her to agree to the trade deal because it costs her only 1/3 ounce of meat on the trade, while it costs her up to 1/2 ounce of meat without trade. After all, we can completely call that trade makes sense that Frank and Ruby are better off under the trade deal. And we can come to conclude that trade can benefit everyone in society such that it allows people to specialize in activities in which they have a comparative advantage. And the principle of comparative advantage or trade in general can explain that everyone under the trade agreement has to be interdependence. It means that they must be productive and specialize in what they can do best. But they have to be dependent on one another. And after all, everyone will gain from the trade. Here we come to take the quiz. Question number 1. In an hour, Mateo can wash 2 cars or mow 1 lawn, and Sophia can wash 3 cars or mow 1 lawn. Who has the absolute advantage in car washing, and who has the absolute advantage in lawn mowing? When discussing the absolute advantage, we only need to know who can produce more quantities than other. Here it says that given the same 1 hour, Mateo can wash 2 cars while Sophia can do up to 3 cars. So Sophia has the absolute advantage, whereas for lawn mowing, none of them has the absolute advantage because both of them can mow 1 lawn the same in 1 hour. So the answer is D. Sophia in washing, neither in mowing. Question number 2. Between Matteo and Sophia, who has the comparative advantage in car washing and who has the comparative advantage in lawn mowing? We have learned that comparative advantage is the ability that a trading partner can produce a good at the lower opportunity cost. So let us calculate the opportunity cost. For Matteo to mow one lawn, it costs him 2 car washings. Or to do 1 car washing, it costs him 1/2 lawn mowing. For Sophia to mow one lawn, it costs her 3 car washings. Or to do 1 car washing, it costs her 1/3 lawn mowing. So in car washing, Sophia has the lower cost. Then she has a competitive advantage. And in lawn mowing, Matteo has the lower cost. So he has the competitive advantage. Then the answer is B. Sophie in washing, Matteo in mowing. Question number 3. When Matteo and Sophia produce efficiently and make a mutually beneficial trade based on comparative advantage, then what? Since we just found that Matteo has a competitive advantage in lawn mowing and Sophie has a competitive advantage in car washing, then we can say that Matteo should specialize in lawn mowing and Sophia in car washing. So the answer is A. Matteo mows more and Sophia washes more. Question number 4. A nation will typically import those goods in which what? Here, let's think like this. Suppose that a home country can produce the same good at a lower cost than a foreign country. It does not make sense that the home country will import the same good from the trading partner because it is more expensive to buy from abroad than producing at its own local economy. So it rather makes more sense that a nation will only import if they find that other nation has a competitive advantage over them. So here the answer is D. Other nations have a comparative advantage. Question number 5. Suppose that in the United States, producing an aircraft takes 10,000 hours of labor and producing a ship takes 2 hours of labor. In China, producing an aircraft takes 40,000 hours of labor and producing a ship takes 4 hours of labor. What will these nations trade? Let us write down the scenarios. For the United States, it takes 10,000 hours of labor to produce one aircraft and 2 hours of labor to produce one ship, while for China, it takes 40,000 hours of labor to produce one aircraft and 4 hours of labor to produce one ship. Now, if we take to consider in a case that under 40,000 hours of labor, the United States can produce 4 aircrafts. And under 4 hours of labor, the United States can produce 2 ships. And China, under this time limit, can produce 1 aircraft and 1 ship. So we can define the opportunity cost here, such that the United States has 4 aircrafts for 2 ships. Or we can simplify it to 1 aircraft equals to 1/2 ships, or 1 ship is 2 aircrafts. If we put them in comparison, we can find that the opportunity cost of the United States to produce an aircraft is cheaper at 1/2 compared to 1 ship as China can do, while China can produce a ship at a lower opportunity cost than the United States, such that they can make 1 ship for 1 aircraft, while the United States can do 1 ship for 2 aircrafts. After all, we can choose answer B, such that China will export ships and the United States will export aircraft.